Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. July 9th marks 30 years since the first DEF CON back in 1993. 30 years ago is, of course, an ancient era of the internet. So what topics were on that ancient agenda? Let's see. A talk titled Computer Privacy, First Amendment, Gender Roles and Discrimination that mentioned things like workplace monitoring, an announcement about a new scanning tool, a talk on the law's intersection with VR and liability in simulated worlds, which noted how the hardware is moving to an interface that the user doesn't notice, and that the law is untested against such worlds. All of which sounds so very, very quaint and relevant and unresolved, and from 30 days ago rather than 30 years. Well, anyway, which means this week we chat with Shannon Lietz about software trust and why looking at adversary management can improve the resilience of your systems. We're also doing something different this week. We have a second interview with Melinda Marks to chat about developer-focused security that's more meaningful than shifting left. Stay relevant and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Business Security Weekly is recorded on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each week, we address the challenges facing CISOs through our guest interviews, including former and active CISOs. Our news segment is focused on leadership and communication to better help security leaders translate and communicate security risks into business risks. Jason Albuquerque, Ben Carr, Tyler Robinson, and others add their expertise to the conversation. I'm Matt Alderman, and I hope you search for Business Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher and subscribe to download our latest content.
Developers have a need for speed to meet market demands, and application security needs to ensure that data and privacy constraints are met. Unfortunately, that can slow down delivery. So, is it even possible to deliver secure software quickly? Enter Secure Coding, brought to you by GuidePoint Security's Application Security Services. Secure coding is more than a process, it's a cultural shift, one that will make it possible for both developers and AppSec to build in security while applications are being developed. Visit our AppSec resource hub to learn more at securityweekly.com/guidepoint. This is episode 246, recorded June 27th, but will show up around July 10th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
I'm trying to stay relevant and figure out if I'm the same person I was 30 years ago. I hope I'm not, but...
Let's ask ChatGPT. If you want to stay relevant, John, you can now find us on Instagram as well as share your own Instagram because we've got some highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. And we'll find out what John's Instagram is later. But first, Shannon Lietz is a 30-year-plus-year award-winning technology and cybersecurity innovator. She is currently the CEO of ThirdScore, a risk management company leading the way towards greater software trust. She is also founder of DevSecOps and leader of the Rave community. Previously, Ms. Lietz was VP of Product and Software Security at Adobe, driving the security of Adobe's products and third-party ecosystem. She has worked and consulted for many of the Fortune 500, supporting cybersecurity and digital transformation using metrics to guide her work. Hello, Shannon. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there. It's great to see both of you, Mike and John. John, it's been a while.
It's great to have you back, of course, too. We had you back an ancient episode ago, but we want to talk about metrics today and trust, because I think, metrics can be a little bit tough. Trust can be a little bit tough to earn and easy to lose, but you're doing all sorts of things now. Let's actually, I mentioned trust first. Maybe start us off with this Rave metrics and what these metrics are and why trust is going to come up quite a bit in our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. Probably a couple of years ago when I switched jobs from Intuit to Adobe, it was a highlight for me to basically see the industry as it was at the time. And software trust is something that I hold dear. In fact, if you look back at, I think, 2013, when I first did the DevSecOps pipeline, what was really interesting about that was I actually said in there that we were building trust back into software through that pipeline. And if you think about shifting left, where do we start to lose trust? It has to do with all the decisions that we make as software professionals and the things that we do to get software out the door, whether that be, cutting a corner, changing something ineffectively, whatever it might be. And so the pipeline itself to create value has to actually also include trust. I think we have lost our way a bit in the software industry, simply because most technology is relatively hard to set up. Let's be honest. It's not like you're going to go find something magical. Even no code these days is challenging. I've had my hands on lots of no code, low code just to see how easy it could be, right? and I think what I've found is there's lots of reasons why you might gain trust with a user, and there's lots of reasons why you might lose trust. And I think they're all effectively measurable, but we focus a lot on metrics as small, discrete things, and not necessarily as a broad whole that covers both creating value and trust at the same time. So that's why the Rave community for me has been such a big deal, is to get a unified set of metrics, whether it be incorporating DORA metrics or bringing in securability or whatever it might be to create this notion of trust end to end. I think that's been pretty paramount.
No, I think I'll joke and say so far the metrics we've got are like, as you say, it's difficult to build software. We have 20 plus page PDFs to harden Kubernetes and other things. We have even a top 10 list for no code. OWASP came out with that. So we've got 10 things to do there, even with code, but I don't think those are real useful metrics. What are the things that you're pointing to that show that we're being successful, that we're making a difference, or that even like we should trust some software, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know most people go out to the review sites and they look for their software by comparing features and seeing how other users use them. And what that really turns out to be is adoption. Folks have preferences. You might find out that you have similar preferences. And so you are looking at what is equivalent to a set of adoption metrics. Folks that like the software, folks that don't like the software. But you're not seeing this really interesting view of resilience, adoption, velocity, and error rates, which is what RAVE stands for. And my belief is that we tend to look at most software unbounded. And because we look at it unbounded, we can't really reconcile what we're seeing. So if you were to see great adoption, you don't necessarily know how that fits with resilience. Is the application resilient? Well, it could be that everybody loves the features and they're willing to put up with downtime, as an example. And these are really important, critical ways for us to think about how we trust. We have to think about pillars for trust. We care about, as software professionals that use software, or even just folks that are adopting software, the resilience of our application. If, for example, say that application had an availability challenge or had a security incident, it's not as resilient. It wasn't resilient by design. And that's going to be a problem for us, even if we're starting to adopt. In fact, what you're going to find is that adoption might be swayed from having a lack of resilience, and then you'll see a churn rate associated with it. Same is true with velocity. If somebody creates software, and let's just say that it takes 5 years for them to change that software, you might actually be like, I don't want your software because, yes, it fits my needs now, but in like 2 minutes, it's probably going to be outdated. And so if the velocity of features aren't coming out as you expect them or need them, or you're not seeing fixes as you expect them or need them, then velocity can have an impact, again, on adoption. And finally, we have errors. And errors is actually really interesting because this is where we see that if somebody's building a lack of quality into their software, even though it's coming out fast and it's coming out with great features, super wanting this particular piece of software, if it has a ton of errors in it, and you're constantly patching or having to fix that software, if there's a significant problem with it that makes it hard to leverage those features, then you're really not going to be able to trust that software package. And so you want both positive metrics and you want to have negative metrics interwoven to really display what we mean by trust. Now, what I know about trust is we're not all the same. You might have specific metrics that you care about more than I do. So the pillars of resilience, adoption, velocity, and errors is most important to creating the bounded framework for trust. And what you actually put into those, let's say that you only have one metric for resilience as an example, then that may be all you need to know that your software is what you need it to be. But others might have 25, 30, 50 metrics that they track for resilience because it's that important to their particular situation. Mm-hmm. And in that case, they may have a greater need for resilience. But you don't want to actually sway it based on the metric. You don't want to have arguments about which metric is more important. Well, maybe you might.
It's funny, this sort of, it resonates with me a little bit, Shannon. Maybe not every single piece, but we've talked on here in the past, like if you're looking at, this is an open source GitHub type analogy to it. But if I'm looking for a project on GitHub, do I want to use it or not? I've got the A, V, and E. I don't have the R, I don't think. But like, I'll look like how many stars does it have? Is there a bunch of issues? Is there pull requests? Are they getting resolved? Is there communication happening? So you can see sort of this happening in that open source community without having to worry about. You can use it as an example without thinking about going straight to the commercial. The resilience part, I think you'd have to actually run it, but still. It's interesting to see you codify that. It's something that's been in my head, but not quite so eloquently put.
Yeah, and you know, it's intuitive. These pillars are super intuitive to us. We've talked about them for many years. I think when you bring up resilience, what I find is that it would be really helpful if somebody did know what their availability is, their average availability, if they knew what their securability was. They actually did reconcile it as part of their package. Wouldn't you care deeply that somebody actually had low resilience, but they've got high features, high velocity? You still may use that package of software, but now you know that you may have to mitigate the resilience.
Yeah, and I think what also too is that the approach sounds very reminiscent of a developer-oriented approach. These are things that a developer is going to be considering looking at, even as John was describing that. Developers aren't going to be worried, oh, what is the exploitability score for this? How many CWEs are in here? Are they using CVSS v3 or v4? Nobody cares. Like, that doesn't help the developer decide on the resilience, meaning like, is this a critical path for a payment gateway? So we do need high resilience versus this is something that has latency, doesn't matter. Resilience can be lower for whatever reason, because that's our use case. So already you've got me as well now being swayed by just this is friendly, and I think you said like familiar as well. So I do want to bring in other words that start with R and talk about risk. So sure. What is this episode brought to you by the letter R? What is the relation with risk and rave so that we can look at resilience and have something reasonable for our security?
Recommendations.
So we can have that conversation with AppSec or with our CISO. Thank you, John.
Yeah, absolutely. So, security professionals tend to get the hand, if you will, by developers about the issues that they might bring up. And the challenge that I've found through my research, through my work through the years, has been that is because we're not actually talking about trade-off. So when we think about risk, we actually have thresholds associated with metrics, but because we don't actually set them as an industry, we can't really have a conversation about them. When you talk about a metric with a developer, commonly they actually know what their thresholds are. Like if you actually walked up to a developer and said, hey, your app is it is up 98% of the time and down 2% of the time, they're worried about getting fired. Because really a 2% threshold is too high for that particular application if a customer is actually leveraging it. Now, in other cases, it could be that 2% is okay. And so there's a need for us to talk about risk in terms of tolerance. So if we were to think about this, we need to have metrics associated with security. They need to have tolerances. For example, you might not fix every single security vulnerability that you have in your environment, but you might fix all of the publicly available exploitable vulnerabilities. And you may say that there's a zero tolerance for those. You may also say that a default password in your environment is a zero threshold, meaning you're not going to allow default passwords in your environment because they're just that risky. And so when you put it into this framework and you're actually able to then compare, say, availability to securability, and you're able to now create some level of trade-off in a pillared format, you can have a conversation that's more easy for somebody who isn't necessarily a security domain expert. And your expertise can be brought to the table in a way that allows for there to be lanes to have conversations. And I think this has been what's really been missing from an industry perspective for quite some time.
Now, you mentioned like the nines of resiliency. You know, we've got 1 9, we've got 5 9s, we've got, you know, S3 buckets have something silly like 10 9s, or, you know, Godzilla stomping on the coast. This is the only thing that's going to take it down. So, and I was making fun of, perhaps deservedly, CVSS scores, but that's an easy 1 through 10. What do rave metrics? How do we talk about using rave metrics? Give us some examples of how they come into that conversation. So we say we have a rave of 4 to the floor, and we got some 90s techno or something silly like that. That's
waiting for that.
Going to be good for a specific audience, but not for CISOs, perhaps.
Yeah, so for resilience, it tends to be 5 9s is the greatest way to explain resilience. So having some of those metrics be able to be adapted to 9s is very helpful, which is why when I started working on securability, I worked with a bunch of developers on securability. I worked with folks that basically said, I want to know why I should care, why I should actually be concerned. When something drops, I should be able to be reactive towards it. And so I wrote an article recently about securability and the notion of what it takes to have principles associated with it. They're very developer specific. So if you think about it, we want these metrics, these KPIs to be business friendly, developer friendly first. So as AppSec professionals, product security professionals, the first thing we got to do is win over the army of people who are putting together and constructing software. And I think that comes from making it so that they can understand the metric, not necessarily us. We're, those 5 9s of CVSS scores. I haven't really figured out how to adapt to that yet, although I will say that CVSS scores are really helpful to be metadata when you're thinking about what is in the denominator of, say, securability. So taking in, say, something that's a CVSS score of 10 can be helpful for you to be able to say, yeah, that should be part of the denominator of securability. And oh, by the way, it's really easy to go show and demonstrate that that vulnerability could be exploited. And therefore, we should fix it right away. That's going to be a trade-off that's going to be super easy with the business, because now you've got a demonstrable resilience issue that now can be traded off. That if the rest of the metrics are all 5 9s and that one's dropped to the lowest part, it's the red flare, if you will. And I do think that you're going to see that if you were to comparatively measure things, that you're going to have a lot of that resilience issue be associated with security most often. I think the red flare in the resilience column is commonly security, and more often than we'd like to actually admit to. But because we're so focused on not being part of the fold with development and business, that we actually are our own special snowflake, we miss out on that opportunity to really have the opportunity to talk about these things. And I will tell you, having done it for years, it's a challenging conversation to sit in a room with a developer and hash it out to say, my bug is more important than your availability problem. And I can show you why. And I can show you that your availability problem is related to my securability problem. And so, it takes a minute to get those skills, to get that, thought process in place, but very valuable.
I guess one of the questions around that real quick is, and I sort of know the answer on this, but when you're having that conversation about quote unquote my vulnerability, were you having more issues with the developer or with their manager? In other words, how you prioritize that?
Oh, all. Developers want to know specifically what they need to do to appease their manager. So if you can't make that prioritization call, that's going to be a hard thing to do. Most developers that I find want to do the right thing by security. They realize that, that's going to be the thing that wakes them up at night. They do have that interest to have safer software. And I think at the same time, from a developer perspective, what they find is that their product manager is not on board or whatever it might be. And I also think that because we don't, and I'm going to use it, shift left our conversation towards product management and talk about how security has to be part of the budget. For example, if you're going to use a library that's outdated within your scheme of developing something, and you know you're taking on that debt, then you're going to have to open up your security budget and maybe put in 1 day a week is going to go towards security hygiene. It might even be that you actually have to create your own patch of some sort. And these are things that I don't think that we're actually having the conversation about early enough in how we're thinking about security being part of and built into software.
And that makes, and partly why I like the E of error rates, that's very understandable for developers. That helps them, like you said, they want to know what's going on. Is this a gnarly bug that's going to keep paging me on call at midnight, which is really going to annoy me, or is this spurious? It happens once a week, and we would really love to solve it, but we have to make sure we just manage our time accordingly. Resilience also sounds like that in terms of uptime or how quickly you can also recover. Do you have graceful degradation? Obviously, graceful degradation is important for some areas, but you don't want to necessarily have graceful degradation in security. Some type of security does need to be a hard stop or fail secure. And where I'm going with this is that idea of you mentioned securability. Now, resiliency, error rates, those make sense to me. I think I'm pretty familiar. We talk about risk. We want to drive down risk, reduce risk. Tell me a little bit about securability. Are we trying to get 100% security? Which, it's a bit of a leading question because I don't think that's possible. And I don't think that's what you're saying. So what does securability sound like here or look like here?
You're not going to ever have 100% security, but you could have 100% securability.
Okay.
So it is entirely possible that in your organization, for example, let's just say you have a policy that says 0 default passwords. If those never get entered into your environment, then they're never going to be part of the denominator, meaning they don't exist. And so by default, that will be 0, meaning you have 100% securability. You're not actually bringing that into your environment. And so now, of course, to do business, you are going to make trades. You are going to take risk. And that means that in your denominator are the things that are most likely going to get adversarial interest. They're the ones that are most likely to get exploited. And if you don't actually know where your exploits are coming from, it means you don't have great control over it. So from a control system perspective, we should actually know, and we do threat models, right? We should actually know what our denominator is or have a close approximation to what that denominator is. And this is where I find that the industry itself is not bounded enough in how we make these decisions. We tend to talk about threats, and we talk about it could be anything, right? It's just open and loose. And the truth is that it's not actually. When you think about where vulnerabilities exist, where they stem from, for example, if you allow a user input and you don't validate that input, it's very likely that you're going to see abuse within that input. And more likely as you get bigger, maybe more likely as you get more attractive or have features that are interesting to adversaries, or they can make money off of you. And so I think it's really critical for us to realize that having the hold over, whether you're right, wrong, precise or not, having some understanding of what is in that denominator is critical to the success of your security program. So when you look at securability, the reason why I said it's probably always going to be your red flare resilience issue is because that is where most companies take some of their risk is within security, is we can't be perfect. So therefore, we are going to allow this. We are going to allow that. That level of risk is actually still going to be in your denominator, still managing it. And if you have surprise issues coming through as incidents, then you're not actually starting with a defined security budget, which means you don't actually have control. We talk about it as asset management, but the truth is you need to take your asset management, figure out what the threats are that you're most concerned about, and that becomes part of the calculation of what's actually going to be probably what comes up in your incident stream.
Indeed, and you use surprise. There's an old definition, I think, by Dan Geer, who described security as the amount of unmitigatable surprise, which I've always enjoyed. And Shannon, you were here talking. And you were talking about threat modeling and also adversaries here. So threat modeling, I think of what could go wrong, what should we do about it, et cetera, et cetera. You also we've talked in the past about adversary management, adversary scorecards. You're taking, I think it sounds related to threat modeling, but it might not be as familiar. Tell us a little bit about why you're taking this adversary angle to things as well, and how that hits resilience.
Yeah, so adversaries in particular have motivation. The hardest thing for them to change is how they monetize. Whether they do monetize is a different problem, but how they monetize, whether it be through fame, glory, whatever it might be, they actually sell your credentials somewhere, whatever their scheme is, that's the hardest thing for them to change. It's also what directs their motivation. It's what directs their threats. It's the first part of what they go after in terms of initial access, and it's the directive from which they come. As a security industry, as developers, we all look at what are the threats associated with my application, and then we apply sort of a one-size-fits-all from a lens perspective. And the truth is that there are adversaries out there with greater skill, and there are adversaries out there with lower skills. Just getting into the marketplace, might try something, get lucky. Some adversaries are good. And so, yeah, you're going to always have those risks that you might set out and set forth. But when it comes down to it, if we're not actually applying a test plan that leverages an adversary profile, we're probably missing out. And here's why. Let's just say that you have a default password, again, going back to that particular use case. And let's just say that there's a script kiddie out there who knows that particular password, and they can actually run a scanner. They might get lucky some percentage of the time. And if you're not also checking for that default password in your environment, because they're going to get lucky, you're going to end up with an issue, and it's going to be a surprise, likely. So the question that I have for everyone in the industry is, why aren't we actually testing all of our script kiddie problems? We know them. We actually have some idea of what those are. We write up top 10 lists, but we don't actually create scorecards that help us to understand where we are doing well and where we're not doing well. So my belief is, if you run adversary personas down one side of the page and you put your lowest level of skill at the bottom, let's say script kiddies, and you put your highest level of skill, maybe the nation states or the supply chain risk of the world, right? Those are your top, those are your bottom. And you were to go after all your applications, you were to look at your environments a certain way and run your tests, you're going to have little green chips for some things because, hey, you don't actually have risk in those scenarios, which means you can move on. And where you do have risk, you're going to be able to apply your ability to mitigate those risks, or even defend by monitoring and being aggressive in your response. And that scorecard, because it's missing throughout the industry, is something that I believe we're actually challenged by. We're having a hard time talking about these things with the business. And here's the most interesting thing, that adversaries are just some percentage of the total customers that come to your environment. Whether they're actually potential customers, they're converted customers, they actually do end up in that traffic, whether one way or another. And so the idea here would be, what percentage of the traffic coming to your site is abusive? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Do you know? Do you have some idea? And most companies actually do, if they're looking at their traffic patterns, if they're looking at their SEO, if they're looking at what's actually coming to their website and looking at their conversion rates. There's a lot of interesting information about what is adversarial in the environment and what's been invited and what's not allowed, that becomes part of what I think you need to have as an application security professional. Having that data can be really, really helpful in knowing how to tune the controls that you're trying to actually create.
Yeah, and I think that tuning is the key part for me, because you can't control how many adversaries are out there. You can't create fewer or greater teenagers looking for, joyriding the Twitters and Ubers of the world, or bug bounty hunters for that matter. Maybe you'll incentivize them more or less based on your rewards. but it's more of this is what that traffic looks like because it is just somebody running Dirbuster, somebody running a simple scanner, somebody running this, that why aren't you running that yourself, I think is your point here. And that's not like, meaning that it's not over-indexing on who's attacking us, but where their techniques, how are they attacking us, is
That's
what
right.
I think the adversarial is you're hinting at here. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you have bug bounty, let's just put it out there. You're going to have some that are friendly, you're going to have some that are unfriendly, but they're still going to use the same capability. Why does anybody pay for a subdomain takeover these days? I just don't understand it. If you have enough professionals in your environment to be able to help you to run those tools, why do you pay for it? Why do the big companies pay for those? Because they should be able to classify that particular type of traffic, clear it out, say, you know what, we've tested it. They might get surprises here and there, but if a bulk of what they're doing is actually missing, then they're not again in control of how their application is set up and what they've done to defend it.
Okay.
I've
got one. I want to. I'm not trying to poke the bear, but I'm curious to see your response to this.
Poke the bear.
So we started off at the top of the hour talking about things should be secure by default and all these type of things, and everyone who goes and installs Kubernetes should have to go through that 25-page document. Why does everyone have to go and get those scanners and set them up themselves individually and actually get them going? Maybe there should be an easier way to actually do the offensive side of that as well?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that setting things up from an offensive perspective, why isn't there a test plan that you're able to bring into your environment? When you have the Kubernetes 26-page document, why isn't there a test plan associated with it? You have to harden. The hardening guideline is actually setting up the testable capability. And if you ran it at the end, you smoke tested it at the end, you'd have a great regression that shows that everything you did was as secure as possible. Again, we're not going to get to perfect. That isn't actually what I'm saying. We're going to have some level of securability that we cannot accommodate because, oh, by the way, it would cost us billions of dollars to deal with that, and it's not worth it. But we're going to know what we're running with. And I think that's the most important thing is, are you running at 99.9 or are you running at 95.7, which means, hey, sometimes you might have some risks. And now as an end user of your software, I'm going to know I actually do have some risk here, but because it's such amazing software, I'm willing to take that risk. And that's where you build trust, is the ability to be transparent. This is where CISA comes in. And this is why as AppSec, CISA coming in with what it's asking for from a transparency perspective, you can't run around and go say, hey, I've got all these incidents and talk about exactly what's happening in a company. But you could talk about your metrics and you could talk about some of the things that are important to know that are going to give me some indication that you've got control over your environment versus, say, all the particulars. I don't need to know every single specific detail of the incidents that you're encountering, but I would like to know that you have some understanding of your environment enough to have a threshold to know whether or not it's succeeding and to be transparent about it.
So part of this, we also started talking about the Rave community, Rave metrics. How can people learn more about this? And how can they get involved in understanding this is something new and different, right?
Yep, we've got a site, rave.community. We've got a survey out right now to figure out what metrics do people really like, which ones are actually winning. We've been keeping track of those. It would be great if everybody could take the survey because what we intend to do is share that information out. We're writing up a glossary right now of all of the metrics that we've got understanding of. And that glossary is going to be made available over the course of this next 6 months. If you're interested in metrics at all, please do contact me. It would be great to work with you and to include you in this community as a founding member of it.
That'd be cool. And you also mentioned writing. You've got some new writing coming up as well. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I just started back on Medium. I've got a few articles out there. I've committed to 4 a month. I'm going to try and do more than 4 a month, but really sharing more of what I've learned over the years so that we can get to a more measurable future, so we can really push on software trust. And I'm starting to have conversations with different companies about how they might help encourage greater software trust, having conversations about maybe test plans that we can put in place, and really raising that bar, if you will, against adversaries. My belief is it would be great if we could cause them to go away because we're actually testing ahead of them and the surprises are getting to be fewer.
Well, I do have one semi-surprise for you. And rather than committing to four articles a month, I need you to commit you to 3 words. We always ask our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. So what's your response to this one, Shannon?
Software safer sooner.
Software safer sooner. Absolutely wonderful. And I think we could measure most of that as well, which is always good.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to put our measurement where our mouth is.
Indeed, and you've given us some wonderful time in this this segment for telling us about all that and the rave. So I just want to say thank you, Shannon. This has been a fun conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for poking the bear, John. Great.
Also want to say thank you to John and thank you everyone who's been listening. We're going to take a quick break now and return with our second interview segment.